Hi, and welcome to Podcast 3. I'm Angela Benedict. Shadow qualities. A 15th century general who devastated the Ottomans. Vietnam and integrity. Ruthlessness is a shadow quality. All of us have shadow qualities, and most of us have been taught to deny them, pretend they don't exist. Can ruthlessness be valuable? As I was growing up, I was often accused by the people around me, family members, of being ruthless. As I got older, I began to realize that they made this accusation when I was doing something they couldn't do. It was their insecurity speaking. When we look at those, and I put this in quotes, ruthless people, we notice that they are often decisive, often uncompromising, direct in their speech and their actions, the kind of people who frighten others who are not those things. So, again in quotes, ruthless people draw lines in the sand, which may challenge others to have to decide where they stand. There is a low tolerance level for ambiguity, but the ruthless people, by their very existence, by challenging, by drawing attention to, by not allowing for gray areas to prevail, create meaningful boundaries. Now, we can point to examples of what we call those, again, quotes, ruthless people, and we tend to think about them as self-serving, callous, unfeeling, unconcerned with other people. For me, this shadow, which we all have, was used as a weapon against me, to silence and control me. It was condemning. It was how I was demonstrating wrongness. In fact, it was how I was demonstrating initiative, clarity, and leadership. I unfailingly did what others could not in many situations in my backstory. It was a demonstration of strength. But when strength and vision are demonstrated amongst the insecure and fearful, the response can be to tear the leader down, not celebrate or reward their ingenuity or courage. Many leaders over time have been blackballed, attacked, despised for trying to create meaningful change, but many persevered and drew into being change that would not have been possible if it were not for those who draw lines in the sand. I'm a historian by passion and by training. I love it, and one of my university degrees is in history. I wish more emphasis was placed on learning from it, especially within the military context. Many mistakes would be avoided if we paid more attention to what lessons have already been learned and could be applied. If the U.S. military had studied a little harder about what the British had faced in Iraq, that conflict may have been approached differently. If Afghanistan was approached with all of the historical knowledge available, perhaps it would have been directed a little differently. As it stands, these regions are much as they have always been, and there seems to be little hope for them to be much else. The level of corruption, the outdated philosophy that exists there, do not align well with advancement. This has historical grounding. Ottoman armies and empires have experienced the same issues over time, including a resistance to embrace that which does not culturally align itself. Technological advances have been integrated, but not cultural changes to the same extent. Back so far as the 1530s, there was a spread of new weapons technology into the armies of Suleiman, then Sultan of the Empire. As Sultan, he controlled a massive military force. He made seemingly odd strategic alliances, including with the King of France, who was happy to have an ally against Habsburg Spain. Due to this alliance, the Ottomans gained access to experienced French infantrymen, including seasoned officers. This was not atypical, as tens of thousands of European veterans were fighting in all of the major Muslim armies. What is interesting is that even though there was a significant human dimension presence, and there was an integration of new weaponry, tactics did not change. This was reinforced through the 18th and 19th centuries when, again, European experts were hired to reform the Ottoman army, but found it almost impossible to enforce changes that went against the cultural grain. Can we see a parallel today with the integration of technology being leveraged by ISIL without a corresponding cultural or philosophic expansion? One of my favorite books is called Skanderbeg. He was a general who fought against the Ottomans in the 15th century. What struck me the most in reading this book was how much he loved. He loved his men, he loved his woman, he loved his God, he loved his country. It was so obvious in all he was. He was born George Castriot in Albania. He was son of a prince. His father could not overpower the Ottomans, who offered a choice instead of destroying his kingdom: destruction, or we take your son as a hostage. George went into slavery. But interestingly, he was not ill-treated, quickly proved his worth to the Sultan, and gained the Sultan's trust. His mindset during his separation from everything he loved was to learn all he could about his enemy. He convinced the Sultan that he could develop the Sultan's army into a better fighting force, but to do so he would need his own men. The Sultan agreed and sent for, or kidnapped, Albanians to fight under George. George trained them, slept in their quarters even though he had beautiful lodging in the palace. He mentored them through the hardships of being separated from home and among the enemy force that had destroyed so much of their homeland. George convinced the Sultan to provide his men with horses and even their own flag with a personalized coat of arms. George's men became the elite fighting force of the Sultan, and they never lost a battle under George's command. It was at this time that the Sultan gave George a new name: Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, in reference to Alexander the Great. Then one day, mid-battle, Skanderbeg led his men away. They returned home, they formed up an army 10,000 strong, and they waited to be attacked. The Sultan was, of course, furious and sent 100,000 troops. The Sultan's force was defeated. Skanderbeg tried to gain the support of neighboring regions, but they were all terrified of the Ottomans and they wouldn't join with him. For the next 25 years, Skanderbeg was the deterrent between the Ottomans and the rest of Western Europe and Christendom. He routinely defeated the Ottoman army despite being massively outnumbered every time. Now, I've painted this in kind of a rosy way. There is no doubt that he was a skull-crushing, ruthless leader who is credited with 3,000 kills on the battlefield. That's nasty, even for medieval warfare. I think what appeals to me about this man is he never doubted he would win. He never lost sight of his goals. He never let his men down. He stayed true to what he valued. I believe that's called integrity. The hands-down most entertaining version of his story I've ever read is on badassoftheweek.com. What would we do without the ruthless people? We all have this shadow part to us. We can all kill. We can all love. Not so many draw lines in the sand. Medieval warfare is very far removed from us, even those of us who love history. It's a memory, not a personal experience. However, we have veterans now, many of them, who have that personal experience of being in a war. One of the most profound wars of this era was Vietnam. I say it is profound for several reasons. It was the first televised war. It was the first publicly debated war, with much of that happening in public spaces through demonstrations. It was the first time we heard of widespread retaliation from soldiers against their officers. It was the first time there was a major military movement that led to widespread social justice. In all wars, there are men who stand out. I say men because predominantly this has been a man's occupation. In another podcast, I will be addressing women in war, currently and historically. But for millennia, men have served and led. They have made the decisions in war rooms and corporate boardrooms that war is needed. Armies have been the instruments of economics and politics across time. In a recent podcast that I listened to by Jocko Willink, who's a former SEAL commander, he speaks of David Hackworth. Now, Colonel Hackworth is considered one of the heroes of the Vietnam War. He was ruthless. He was an agent of change. His men hated him. They wanted to kill him until they understood him and loved him. During the Vietnam War, we learn of a new term, fragging. This was the practice of enlisted men blowing up their officers. If unreasonable, unactionable, this will only get us all killed orders were given. There had been such massive mistakes that finally a grassroots initiative began to turn the tide with the intention of better orders, missions that made sense, and higher survivability. Hackworth and Skanderbeg have similarities, a shared approach. Lead from the front, attack aggressively, ignore overwhelming volumes of fire. They were both known for their use of successful tactics, innovative thinking. Both were tasked with creating elite fighting forces under difficult conditions. They will both be remembered for how they took care of their men. Hackworth remains one of the most decorated soldiers in history, and he did a remarkable thing as an officer. He criticized the Army and the war publicly. It ended his career, but you do things like that when you have integrity. Hackworth was reacting to what many other soldiers were also reacting to and speaking out against. Odd for soldiers to do so in such public displays, but there was something really big going on. It was the GI movement. This was a wide-scale revolt inside the U.S. military and affected all branches and led to the breakdown of the military's ability to continue the war. Some say it was the peace marches that swayed the political will at the time and brought the troops home. Not so. The Army began to implode. At its height, it is estimated that nearly half of all enlisted men were involved in this movement. Between 1970 and 73, it is estimated that there were 92,000 deserters. Combat refusals were epidemic, as was fragging of officers. Thousands of soldiers were jailed. The Pentagon concluded that over half of the ground troops openly opposed the war. This resulted in a strategic shift from a ground war to an air war. The Air Force and Navy were both facing widespread mutinies and sabotage. During this time, the organization Vietnam Vets Against the War was formed, which held the Winter Soldier investigation, exposing U.S. war crimes through the testimony of veterans. The Winter Soldier investigation showed that the My Lai massacre was not an isolated event, but was part of a pattern of massacres that were a predictable and frequent result of U.S. war policy. The VVAW staged what has been called the most dramatic demonstration of the Vietnam era, which is quite a statement considering how many demonstrations were occurring and how powerful they were. But this was when hundreds of veterans threw their medals onto the steps of Capitol Hill in front of Congress. This happened April 1971. I have watched documentation of this incredibly emotional demonstration of disillusionment. It set a precedent that has been followed by veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan in May of 2012, and in the United Kingdom by war vets there in December 2015. In each case, the same procession was made, where veterans would come up to a microphone, make a brief but passionate statement, and then throw their medals away. To have sacrificed so much, lost so much, maybe never earned anything so important before, then to feel so shameful about your actions that you are prepared to throw these symbols of achievement away. This is no small demonstration of outrage. This was incredibly difficult to do, and it is really gut-wrenching to watch. Over 100 movies exist about the Vietnam War, while very little footage exists regarding the GI movement. This is not an accident. After the U.S. left Vietnam in 1975, the government began a process of erasing the GI movement from the social memory. Sir, No Sir is a documentary about the GI movement that was produced with interviews from many of the veterans who were pivotal in developing the original movement. You can find it on YouTube. Why do I know about it? Why do I think it matters to know about the GI movement? Because from out of this chaos came unity, and from that unity came a loud voice, soldiers' voices, who did not ask quietly, but started demanding social change. The Vietnam era reordered American society in a huge way, in a way that is still being felt today. From a combat stress perspective, from a recovery perspective, America has not recovered because it has not been able to keep up with the demand for care needed from that era, much less from all of the other conflicts that have been participated in by the military since Vietnam. But here's my main point: demand for care. This took on a whole new meaning because of Vietnam vets. They were the ones who had the numbers and the anger and the voice to demand care from the government for their war wounds. The reason that we know as much as we do, that there has been so much attention given to PTSD, is not because of the mental health community, but because of Vietnam vets. There is a lesson to be learned from history, and soldiers would do well to understand. Soldiers' voices are loud when they are used and when you form a united front. Change doesn't happen from the top down in highly bureaucratic organizations. Vietnam vets created a massive level of change. They stood up for their values, not just what the military valued at that time. I believe that's called integrity. Please connect with me to receive your copy of Countering Combat Stress, a Veteran's Guide, plus 2 free resources. My email is in the description below. A true leader has the confidence to stand alone, the courage to make tough decisions, and the compassion to listen to the needs of others. he does not set out to be a leader, but becomes one by the equality of his actions and the integrity of his intent. General Douglas MacArthur. Till next time, stay safe, be well, peace out.